When I was little, I saw the ghosts of two boys that used to live on my street. For some context, this was at the first house I lived in, and I was around 4 or 5. Keep in mind, I had a pretty overactive imagination as a kid, but this encounter felt so real, and unlike anything I've experienced beforehand. But anyway, let's get on to the story. I woke up in the middle of the night in my mother's room. I forgot why I was in my mother's room, but I remember that she was sleeping, and her room was lighted enough that I was able to look around the room. But when I looked towards her bedroom door, I saw two white figures playing. They appeared to be young, as they seemed smaller than say my father, and seemed around a little older than people my age I knew. They also weren't transparent. These figures had actual mass to them, like shadow people is the best way to describe it, but instead of black, they were white. Anyway, when I saw them, they stopped playing and stared right at me. My whole body froze, and I was unable to say anything. I didn't even want to wake up my mother. I was that frightened to move. Then, the two figures started to walk to me as excruciatingly slow as possible. As they crossed to my side of the bed, one of the boys had reached his hand out to touch me, and then faded away, just as he reached me. It wasn't until a few years later, when I brought this up with my dad, and he told me that he used to see a bunch of ghosts when he was a kid at our house. He grew up in my first house, but he never saw ghosts of two children. He did say that he heard a story growing up that there were two boys that died on the street we lived in. One died falling down the stairs and the other died in some way I forgot, but he didn't know the boys personally. That's all I got. I've told a few people this, and they brought up sleep paralysis, but I felt like I could move. I was just afraid to move in that moment. I did say I had an overactive imagination back then, so it is entirely possible that I imagined it all, but it felt so real, and unlike any night terror I had brought up by my imagination. If you have any explanations, that would be awesome, but for now I'll sign off on that note. I know I lived in a haunted house. I grew up in a really weird penthouse before I was 12. I never liked it. The cathedral ceilings echoed every damned whisper. The upstairs had no windows, and my mom and dad never furnished the space. Everything was an icy white or pale grey. The penthouse was a horrible place and I never got used to it. I should mention that, now that I'm grown, I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in the supernatural, and I don't think there's anything that physics, and non-Newtonian physics, can't explain. But, I know what I know. The house was messed. At night, people would knock on the door over and over but there would never be anyone there. It took a few months, but I learned to stop checking for visitors after dark. One night, I thought I saw the windows warp in front of my eyes. My mother said it was because I was falling asleep, but that's had never happened before, and has never happened since. There was a children's playground a block away in a small parkette. I could hear kids playing there all the time as sunset approached and towards bedtime. I should have known that wasn't right. I knew it wasn't right when my grandmother came to stay one night and was kept up to the wee hours of the morning by the sound of those shrieking children. My neighbors, I thought the woman next door was a tyrant. Every night she screamed at her son. Every night, he wept. Then they moved away, but the screaming never stopped, and the boy never sounded as if he had grown older throughout the years. My father once asked my mother if she was sleeping fine. He kept hearing her turn the faucet in the bathroom on and off throughout the night. He never asked her again after she told him she'd been sleeping through the night. Another time, the radio in my father's empty study flipped on. I comforted my mother and told her the wiring was acting up. This had never happened before and never happened again. I hated that house. I haven't lived there for decades, but I still have recurring nightmares of it. But, and I mean this, I don't believe in ghosts. I don't know what to do. To be honest, I'm getting so stressed out. I don't know why, but my valuable belongings are slowly disappearing. Yeah, it can sound like I'm not a person who takes care of his personal stuff, but that is not the case. In my case, I do always take care of my personal belongings like crazy. In the beginning they were disappearing temporarily, like only for a few minutes. Right now, they are disappearing, and no turning back. It started with my necklace and a bracelet. I took those with me to a religious service for a few months. When I was there they told me that jewelry was forbidden. so I left those in my suitcase. I lived with only one person, and he was with me the whole time, so he couldn't steal it, and he hated jewelry. So after I finally came back home, and I started looking for my jewelry, and boom, it was all gone. There was nothing in the part where I left it. It was so sad, but I got over it. The good news is that I still had my 2 beautiful rings. One of them was quite expensive, like $300, and the other was completely cool and had a Celtic symbol on it, and I felt so in love with it so bad. I wore them when I went to a Halloween party, and after the party, when I was home, I left those in a table in the living room. They were there like 5 days in a row. And after that they were gone. I started searching like crazy, and there is no clue where they went, and today my AirPods recently disappeared. The funny thing is that I was always saying to myself that those items were my most beloved items. Right now, I have none. The I-90 ghost car. A few years ago, I was a university student in Eastern Washington, but dating a girl in Western Washington. I was visiting her for the weekend during the summer when we got into a huge fight around midnight, and I left, deciding to head back to my apartment. I mention this for context as to why I was driving through Snoqualmie Pass after 1 in the morning. I'd never gone through the pass so late before, and what is usually a very busy stretch of freeway on I-90 was completely empty. I went well over an hour without seeing a single vehicle going either way. So naturally, I was driving way too fast. At the time I had a 73 feet Chevy Nova. It wasn't quite the classic, but it had power and a complete lack of AC. Even though it was late at night, the combination of a warm summer night and the large amount of heat that bleeds through from the engine meant that I had my windows down and was sweating. Not far into the east side of the mountains, around 1:30, I hit a long stretch of state road that doesn't have an on-ramp or any way to get into the freeway, when suddenly a set of headlights appeared behind me, something like 200 feet back. I glanced back at the lights, puzzled as to where the vehicle could have possibly come from. I noticed that despite the fact that I was absolutely hauling, the lights were gaining on me. I decided to switch lanes and slow down a bit so it could pass. After a moment, the vehicle, now only half that distance, moved over behind me into the same lane. This is when I began to panic. I'm in the middle of nowhere, hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour, and now I've got some aggressive driver running up on me. I watched as those lights got closer. 60 feet, 50 feet, 40 feet. In seconds it was upon me. I braced against the steering wheel, expecting to get rear-ended by a vehicle going much faster than me now. I watched in my rearview mirror in horror as those headlights blasted right into the back of my vehicle, and suddenly everything froze. Quite literally. Nothing physically hit me, but the whole vehicle frosted over, and I could see my breath. I hit the brakes and did my best to pull over despite not being able to see through the windshield. Every hair on my body was standing on end. I got out of my vehicle and paced back and forth, examining my car, which was already starting to defrost as streams of water poured down it. There was no damage to my back bumper and absolutely no sign of whatever vehicle had hit me. Eventually I calmed down enough to get back in the car and drive the rest of the way back, wake my roommates, and explain what had just happened. The next time I drove through the area in the daylight, right about where I think the ghost car had hit me, there was a very old wooden cross somewhat overgrown on the side of the road. Something in my grandma's basement causing issues. I need some advice for dealing with something in my grandma's basement. We don't know what it is, where it came from, or why it's there. Sage didn't get rid of it, and we are afraid to investigate without some preparation. TL. Doctor at the bottom. For some background, my grandma, grandpa and I moved into new house when I was 6 years old. My grandpa had a stroke and we needed a one-story house since he could no longer climb the stairs, and this house felt perfect. I had always been able to feel weird stuff. My friend says I'm an empath, but I'm not as strong as she is. My dad says he's that way too, that he's always been able to feel ghosts and such. Every other family member I have is on my mother's side and they can't feel the paranormal at all to my knowledge. When we moved into this house, I didn't feel a thing. That is, until I went into the basement. I know this sounds like a terrible horror movie cliche, but please hear me out. I might actually need help here. I went into the basement, and it felt suffocating. I developed a fear of that basement, but being a small child I had no idea why I was scared of it. Whenever I needed to go down there for my grandma, I would inch my way down slowly, grab what I needed, and sprinted back up the stairs. My grandma always joked that I was so serious about exercising. She never felt what I felt down there. Eventually, my aunt and 11-year-old cousin moved in with us because of my aunt's divorce. She needed a place to stay until she could get back on her feet. My cousin had a lot of behavioral problems due to mental disorders and the fact that his parents just got divorced. I was 12 at the time. My cousin and I ended up playing down there a lot. I hated it in the basement, but it was a place we could escape the adults and drama of real life when the weather didn't let us play outside. My aunt and cousin didn't understand why I hated the basement, so I just thought I was being paranoid and buried my fear. But I could never stay down there for longer than an hour straight. Every day I played down there, it felt more and more suffocating. As soon as my cousin and aunt moved out, I avoided the basement as much as I possibly could. When I was around 14, I told a friend of mine about it, and she thought it was haunted and gave me sage to try and cleanse it. It didn't work. I moved out at 18 into my boyfriend's dad's house. A year later my grandma called me and asked me to house sit for a week while she was on vacation, but no boyfriends allowed. I tried to do the first night by myself, but I couldn't even be in the living room for half an hour without panicking. So my boyfriend stayed with me. One night, while we were watching YouTube on the Roku in the living room, we heard a loud crash from somewhere in the house. I was scared someone had broken in, so my boyfriend grabbed a knife and surveyed the house. Nothing was out of place and all the doors were still locked. I didn't sleep much that night and nothing else happened. When grandma had gotten back from her trip, we left immediately. She called us later asking if we had been in the basement. I had avoided the basement the entire time, and so had my boyfriend. She told us her box of VHS tapes that had been sitting on the ground had been thrown and strewn about. The one place we hadn't checked when we heard the loud crash was the basement. This thing had never, to my knowledge, physically interacted with anything before. This scared me, but nothing out of the ordinary happened, since according to my grandma, since I had already moved out, I couldn't monitor the basement. A few months ago my grandma asked me to come over and bring some stuff up from the basement for her, since her back had been bad lately. So I went down and was looking for the thing she wanted when suddenly it felt like my body wasn't my own. I watched myself pull out my phone and try to download a spirit box app with a feeling of I want to talk to you. I snapped out of it, grabbed the things, and ran out of there without a second thought. I had never felt anything like it. It had never felt like it wanted me down there, and it had definitely never wanted to communicate with me before. And I had never felt like I couldn't control my own body before. This was new. And new was scary, but I again made excuses that it was my own curiosity that got the better of me. I developed a paranoia disorder because of the thing in the basement. I couldn't be alone without having a panic attack in that house. Even now after I've moved out, if I'm alone for even half an hour in my apartment by myself, I have panic attacks. I think it really messed with my mental health, but until today I chalked it up to my mental disorder feeding my paranoia about it. My friends and I have been playing D&D at my grandma's house. We had been playing in a back porch room, which doesn't have any insulation and it's getting cold where we live. My grandma suggested we play in the basement, since it's warmer than the porch, and told me to show them around. So I showed my two friends around the basement. One of these friends is the empath I previously mentioned, the other is a paranormal skeptic. Since I had practically convinced myself nothing is wrong with the basement, I brought them down. The basement is in the same shape as the house, which is a J shape. To the left of the stairs is the top of the J, and to the right is the bottom and behind is the hook. I showed them the top first, since it was more open, so more room for us. I felt the usual pressure on my chest, like I was suffocating, but then both the skeptic and empath said they felt a pressure on their chests too. I brought them over to the hook in the J away from the pressure, and it felt fine, until the skeptic walked away back to the top. The empath whispered that she felt it just walk over to us, and then the skeptic came over and said it was no longer in the top of the J, but in the hook. I had to grab some stuff while I was down there, but after I got them out of there, I got confirmation by someone who is super aware of the paranormal and someone who is the opposite and super skeptical about the paranormal, that there is something dark in that basement. And I wouldn't be writing this if it weren't for the skeptic friend. He messaged in a group chat an hour ago that he had been having nightmares about the thing in the basement and he refuses to ever go back down there. He is thoroughly freaked by whatever it is down there, and that has me worried. My previously mentioned aunt and cousin, and now additional 12-year-old cousin, are once again moving into that house temporarily until they get a new house. I'm worried about their safety. This thing is capable of throwing objects and instilling paranoia and fear and other negative emotions into people who are no longer there. It nearly possessed me into opening a spirit box. We also know it's very territorial. I need help. I don't want this thing to get to the point where it hurts someone. My grandma is 81 and is fragile, and she can't afford to move out. My aunt is supporting 2 kids by herself right now and is super stressed. My 12-year-old cousin is young and her mind is vulnerable, and it doesn't help that she is fascinated by the paranormal, but to my knowledge can't sense it. Does anyone know what this thing could be? And any ways to get rid of it? My friends are scared of my grandma's basement now, and I'm scared for the people that are living there, and I really don't know what this is. TL. Doctor, my grandma's basement is haunted, and we don't know what it is, and need advice on getting it out before it hurts anyone.